Without further ado, John, by the way, John grew up in Northeast Philadelphia, or spent part of his time in Northeast Philadelphia, rode the L for many years. He lived in Frankfurt for a period, so he knows the history of Philadelphia transportation and the L specifically, both from a scholarly perspective and from personal experience. So please welcome John Hepp.
Thank you. It's really exciting. Can you all hear me in the back? Is it close enough? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. It's the great advantage of having people in the back. If at any point I become quiet because I suddenly realize I don't have to get very far from this to be quiet, just raise your hand and I'll be noisy. All right. So today what I'm going to talk about is essentially two halves. The first half of what I'm talking about is what I call the prehistory of the Frankfurt L. So why is there a Frankfurt L? What were the thoughts behind it, and what were the technological developments necessary for there to be one? The second half of the presentation will look at the actual plans for the Frankfurt L, the construction of the Frankfurt L, and a very, very, very brief overview of the operation of the Frankfurt L. And so it's basic chronology. All right, I always like to start out by giving you background, why I'm interested in this topic. Because there's going to be questions that you have that I never thought about, and there's going to be questions that I have answers for that you might not care about. So let me sort of give my background. I have both a personal background. My father was a mixture of recent Scottish and much earlier German immigration who grew up in Kensington. And what I always laughed about is when I would talk to him about the Frankfurt L in the 1960s, he basically said as a child in Kensington, he was almost never on the Frankfurt L. He said every so often they would go to Center City to Wanamaker's or something like that, but that was basically it. Both of his parents worked in Kensington. They walked to work. But anyway, so I spent 3 years of my life living in Frankfurt as a kid. And strangely enough, I seldom took the Frankfurt L either. I mean, my memories of riding the Frankfurt L as a child was to go to Wanamaker's for the light show, to go to McGillen's to have drinks after the light show, obviously not as a 5-year-old child, but I accompanied my parents there. And my most exciting train trip of my entire childhood involved the Frankfurt L, and that's in the first days of the Penn Central, before there was such a thing as Amtrak. We rode the Metroliner to Washington, D.C. from Philadelphia. And my trip on the Metroliner began, fittingly enough, on another piece of Bud-built equipment on the Frankfurt L. Now, as Jack commented, my scholarship is mostly on the city of Philadelphia. I have up there my first book, which is called The Middle Class City, and it looks at the development of Philadelphia between 1876 and 1926. If you go to the Encyclopedia Greater Philadelphia website, you'll see about 20 entries that I wrote, almost all on Philadelphia transportation history. So I get to the Frankfurt L by personally being interested in it, having ridden it, but also kind of having a background in transportation history. At the very bottom, I have listed that I'm interested in social and cultural history. So my interest is less on how the Frankfurt L actually really worked, because I'm not an engineer, but more on what people thought about it and how people used it. And one of the things that I've studied, strangely enough, over time, is drinking songs. And I have up there one of my favorite sort of odd coincidences between Glasgow and Philadelphia. The drinking song at the University of Glasgow, which I can tell you, I actually gave a paper there once on the Frankfurt L, and I was actually in the bar, and the professors had the students sing it. Now, you don't know what fun is until you've had 150 drunken students singing happily the song. And the song is, you can't go to heaven on a number 3 car, cause the number 3 car don't go that far. And kind of like how we have numbered bus routes and trolley routes in Philadelphia. The number 3 car was the number 3, as we'd say in middle-class Glasgow, tram that ran between the center of the city and the University of Glasgow and the West End. And Jack and I have actually discussed this. There's a song in Philadelphia called Beat Up Guitar. I know it as a Hooters song from the 1980s. Jack, being basically my age, but a year or two older, knows it as an American Dream song from the 1970s. And in that song, the chorus is, you can't get to heaven on the Frankfurt L, because the Frankfurt L goes straight to Frankfurt. And I've always been fascinated, given the sort of Scottish immigration in the early 20th century, whether there is any connection between these two songs, other than the fact that it's kind of a funny thing and you come up with it. All right, so now I want to talk a bit about the prehistory of the Frankfurt L. Now, to me, one of the reasons why Frankfurt is so interesting is it's, as a village, it's almost as old as the city of Philadelphia is. It dates back to the settlement in Frankfurt. It was in the early to mid 1680s. The city of Philadelphia had its first Quaker immigrants in 1681. It was established as a city in 1682. And so there's been this long connection of Frankfurt being this sort of outer community around Philadelphia. It became fairly important because something called the King's Highway was built very slowly and very inefficiently between Boston, Massachusetts and Charleston, South Carolina. That was begun by Charles II and I think finished by the Georges. And the whole idea of that was basically to come up with a road that would connect the largest northern city on mainland British North America's Atlantic coast, Boston, with the largest southern city on the British North America's Atlantic coast, Charleston. And I have a photograph up here of the King's Highway Bridge, which was built in 1697 and still exists. And the early transport between, if you will, the very small rural village of Frankfurt and downtown Philadelphia, which, we all know the Thomas Home map, and fittingly enough, given where we're located and the importance of Thomas Home, but was you could either go up the road, or you could take the ferry you would take a ferry. Now, one of the things that I spend a lot of time discussing, and actually I had to write something about once, was when is a ferry a ferry? Because sometimes a ferry is a boat that someone takes you along the river and charges you money for, and sometimes a ferry is something regularly scheduled. But so consequently, if you will, Northeast Philadelphia in the 1680s, 90s, and early 1700s was already linked to Philadelphia, and Frankfurt already had a really important role. Now, the first thing that sort of changes this whole relationship is the 1854 city-county merger. Now, most people who study this, study it and look at mostly West Philadelphia, because the early real estate development really took place in West Philadelphia. But essentially, in 1853, Philadelphia was like every other county in Pennsylvania. It had a large central settlement, which was the city of Philadelphia, what we know as Center City today. And then it had a series of smaller settlements, one of which was Frankfurt. And this is a map from 1862 that sort of shows the development in Frankfurt. Frankfurt was truly a rural community at that point in Philadelphia's ambit. But that's all it was. While the map looks really impressive and it makes it look like there's streets everywhere, those streets are lies. Essentially, those streets are where the city of Philadelphia intended someday to build streets. And if you really want to have fun, find the atlases from the 1860s and 1870s of Southwest Philadelphia, because it's going to show you streets that have never been built and most likely will never be built. And so this grid will in fact actually fill in the not too distant future But at this point, Frankfurt's still just a little town, but it's an important town. So this is my, if you will, technological history that gets us to the Frankfurt L and everything that sets it up. And the first thing is the first bit of public transit in Philadelphia, meaning a scheduled thing on a route that charged a recognized fare, and in this case was licensed not just by one colonial government, but two colonial governments, both New Jersey and Pennsylvania, was a ferry in 1688 that connected the city of Philadelphia with Camden directly across the river. It was largely a failure. I think it was bankrupt by the next year. But there continued to be ferries with that connection. The next sort of transit that actually bears directly on Frankfurt was the stagecoaches. And this is a picture of a allegedly stagecoach from 1776. I always find it amazing. You always find things saying, this is from 1776, because of course, that's an important date in American political history. So when you're doing your social and cultural history, people choose it. Stagecoaches took 2 days to go between Philadelphia and essentially Jersey City. And then you took a ferry into Manhattan. They were only for the incredibly wealthy. This is, if you want to think of it, this is if you're taking Uber Black or a town car to New York City. They did not hold many people. They weren't terribly comfortable, but they were fast. And what the stagecoaches really were for, and kind of like what the King's Highway was really for, was to move valuable cargo. And sometimes that valuable cargo was a politician, and sometimes that valuable cargo was a piece of mail being sent by that politician. But this stage stopped in Frankfurt. It was the first stage. They're called stagecoaches, but they operate in stages. And you change your horses, and you have an official stop. And so the stagecoach first stop was in Frankfurt. And for almost the entire 18th century and the earliest part of the 19th century, there were stagecoaches which linked Philadelphia with places in northeastern Pennsylvania that would pass through Frankfurt. 2 transport innovations happened in Philadelphia in the 1830s. Now, one of the things, I do the history of transport globally. So none of these things are unique to Philadelphia. Essentially, everything I'm going to tell you happened elsewhere. But I want to tie these innovations into Frankfurt. And the first one was the horse-drawn omnibuses. Now, essentially, a horse-drawn omnibus was a French invention from the 1820s that was essentially a horse-drawn version of the modern bus. And they were smaller, they were less expensive, they were less elaborate than the stagecoaches, and they tended to run on fixed routes. Now, on the left, you can see a map that I drew from records at the Hagerty Museum and Library in Wilmington that gives you an idea of what the omnibus routes were in 1854. You may say, John, why 1854? Well, the answer to why 1854 is that happens to be the year the records that I was able to find a complete set of records for. But if you'll see, essentially the built-up area of central Philadelphia was covered with these horse-drawn omnibus routes. And all those lines that are disappearing off to the northeast all went to Frankfurt. And so Frankfurt was linked to central Philadelphia by a regular omnibus. And I knew it, and I saw records of this regular omnibus, and I kept on, darn, I'm giving a presentation on the Frankfurt L. Wouldn't it be great if I could find a photograph of a Frankfurt omnibus? Lo and behold, for approximately 25 years, I've used this photograph of of the maritime exchange, excuse me, the Merchants Exchange in central Philadelphia, which is at 2nd Street and still exists if you go there, to illustrate horse-drawn omnibuses. I love this photo because it has an omnibus there in front, but it also, because it's from about 1859, 1860, has the streetcars, which are what's going to replace the omnibus. When I was incredibly bored in putting this together, I did a close-up of that, and what it says is Frankford Road, 4th and 5th Streets. So by pure happenstance, because there are about 30 omnibus routes in the city of Philadelphia, the one that happens to be in the most used photograph is one going to Frankfurt. But it sort of shows you how Frankfurt as a village was linked into the Philadelphia area. The other innovation of the 1830s were the commuter railroads. And they were fairly quickly steam-powered. And this is actually a map from 1910 that I used. It exists. I sort of made it to make a point. And essentially that point was for 1910, and I think it's a useful thing for us to think about today, is in the late 1800s, people regularly said about a 40-minute commute, 40 minutes in the morning and 40 minutes in the afternoon, is a near perfect commute. And the idea was it would get you far enough out of the crowded city, yet you weren't so far out, you were always, always, always on the train. And so what I did this map for is to illustrate the area in blue is the area that was within 40 minutes of Center City by the trolley. And essentially, all developed South Philadelphia time, West Philadelphia, east of 40th Street, and North Philadelphia, south of about Lehigh Avenue, and all what we now know as the city of Camden were within this 40-minute commute. The little green lines are on suburban railroad lines, and that shows you the 40-minute commute on the suburban railroad line. And it was much further out. Now the downside, of course, was it was also much more expensive. So the people who could live in the blue area would be people we would kind of recognize as having typical middle-class jobs, but earning enough money they could take the trolleys or the streetcars before them, while the people that lived in the green area were people we now sort of almost recognize as being more upper middle class. It just cost more to live out there, and it was sort of less convenient. Now to me, the interesting thing about this map is it actually shows the two lines that basically serve the Frankfurt area. One is the Frankfurt branch of the Reading Railroad, and that was at Frankfurt Unity Street, Frankfurt Avenue Unity Streets. The photograph is about from 1900. And the Reading tried in the 1890s and about the first decade of the 20th century to operate a fairly extensive commuter service from there. Their hope was Frankfurt would develop as a commuter suburb, kind of like how Jenkintown did. For a whole variety of reasons, that didn't work out. Then the other one is actually one of my favorite train photographs of all time, and that's the Bustleton Station of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, if, a matter of fact, not far from here, you can follow a Pico utility line that sort of works its way to Bustleton and basically ends not that far from Bustleton and Red Lion Road. That's actually the right-of-way of the Bustleton branch of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And this station was their station at the end of it. Now, unlike the Reading, which spent a whole lot of money to make a really fancy-looking cheap station, the Pennsylvania Railroad is somewhat more practical with their Bustleton station, mainly because there were a lot fewer people in Bustleton at the time than there were in Frankfurt, and they just bought a colonial farmhouse that happened to be in a convenient location. And so you have this charming station, you have what a local train looked like around 1900, which is just two little coaches, and it operated an occasional service that essentially came down in this direction, hit the Trenton line of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and wandered into Center City, Philadelphia, very slowly, and if you think about it, very circuitously, they end up having to go through North Philadelphia Station and everything else. The next transportation innovation that comes along in 1858, and that's a horse-drawn streetcar. And the idea of the horse-drawn streetcar is someone very cleverly realized the problem with the omnibuses is Philadelphia's roads are messy. It's the one constant you have with Philadelphia history. Philadelphia roads have been messy, they always will be messy, and the idea of a horse-drawn omnibus was, if you will, a horse-drawn streetcar was a horse-drawn equivalent of a trolley. And here is my example of a Frankford-based horse-drawn streetcar. The one on the left is actually one in service. It's from 1892, which was the year in which the line was electrified and replaced by trolley cars. So someone evidently came to Frankfurt or lived in Frankfurt and said, I have to record this piece of history that's been part of our story for 35 years and is now going to go away. The photograph on the right actually totally fascinated me because I came across it by accident. And that is a 2nd and 3rd Street line, which is the same as the one on the left. And in 1923, the Philadelphia Rapid Transit Company, the company that operated the Frankfurt L at the time and operated the trolleys in the region at the time, restored this car for a parade in Frankfurt. I still have to find out exactly when and where and why it was used, but it absolutely fascinated me. And what I love about it, though, is if you kind of look at the car on the left, it looks like a rundown thing that could easily be a septibus today. And the car on the right is absolutely beautiful and pristine. And I think it has to do with how we remember history. Now, Frankfurt is also home of one of my favorite technological dead ends in transportation. And that was what is strangely enough occasionally called by scholars a horse-drawn streetcar that's steam-powered. And essentially what it was is they put a steam engine in a car and it operated on the same tracks as the horse-drawn streetcar did, and they were used in Philadelphia as far back as the 1860s. They were actually banned from what we now think of Center City, Philadelphia, because the steam locomotives scared horses. But they actually used them for about 30 years on the Frankfurt Avenue line up in the Northeast. Now we get to what is my actual favorite technological dead end, and something I'm going to write a book on, but haven't got around to it yet. And that's the cable car. We all know cable cars from San Francisco. Cable cars were the hot technology of the early 1880s. In essence, you're going to replace all those horses. Now, why did you want to replace all those horses? Well, horses are expensive, horses poop, and most inconveniently, horses die occasionally in epidemics. And so the whole idea was, how do we get rid of these horses so we can have cleaner streets? And the first answer people came up with was a cable car. Very simple, something that looks like a horse-drawn streetcar, but no horses. You put a channel in the street, and a little grabber comes down and holds on to the cable, and you go along with that. When you want to stop, you take the grabber off the cable, and then you apply the brake. And this shows you two little cable cars in the 700 block of Market Street in Center City. Now, the reason why I love cable cars is they were a technological dead end for a whole series of reasons. First, even well-made cable cars were very difficult to maintain. And Philadelphia, being Philadelphia, did not use the cable car truss technology. To save money, they designed their own cable cars, which were amazingly less efficient than the other ones. But from the 1880s to the early 1890s, Philadelphia and what would later become the Union Traction Company tried their darndest to make the cable cars work. And because they tried so hard and invested so much money in the cable cars, Philadelphia actually got the technological improvement that the whole world was aiming for in the late 1880s, the electric trolley, about 5 to 7 years after it otherwise would have. It took them a long time to give up on the cable car technology. So here's my electric trolley. This is Frankford Avenue. This is a view in 1918, just before the L is completed. This is the cute little, by Bridge Street, the little terminal. And I've always sort of loved this view. This is a wonderful transitional view for Philadelphia trolleys. Almost all the trolleys actually on Frankford Avenue are the newer state-of-the-art trolleys. And since I know I have a lot of trolley enthusiasts here, I mean, one of the things that Philadelphia bus route numbers to this day basically follow the order in which these new cars were assigned to those routes in the 1910. And just in case you're wondering why there is no Route 1 in Philadelphia, because the Route 1 was assigned to the Market Frankford L, but never carried by it. And so that means the first trolley route to get the new trolleys was the 2. And if you have a trolley route like 69, you really didn't get until fairly late in the process. But so there's all new trolleys there, but if you actually look in the little terminal, you can see some older trolleys, especially one sort of peeking around the corner. I love Frankfurt for a very odd reason. Philadelphia, by 1902, virtually all the trolley companies had been combined into a monopoly throughout almost the whole city called the Philadelphia Rapid Transit. One by one, the trolley companies disappeared, and a handful hung on. Probably the largest survivor, and it not only survived this sort of 1902 swallowing up of everything, it actually made it all the way to 1926, was the Frankford, Tacony, and Holmesburg Street Railway. And I will apologize, I spent about 3 weeks desperately trying to find a photograph of one of their cars and totally struck out. So if anyone has one, please contact me, because I would love it. But what I do have is their stock certificate and one of their transfers. But they actually did do transfers with some of the PRT routes in the Frankfurt area. So the final technological breakthrough that gets us to the Frankfurt L is, of course, the Market Street L. And the Market Street L actually gets put into service in over about a 3-year period between 1905 and 1908. And it's actually fascinating. The Market Street L is one of those great stories that if I were doing this instead of in Frankfurt, if I was doing this somewhere in West Philadelphia, I would be spending endless time talking about the political maneuvering that got the very reluctant PRT, and very reluctant doesn't even describe how little they wanted to build a subway elevated line, to finally give in to the city of Philadelphia and build the line. So initially, everything that we know as the Market Street L and the subway surface cars was built using private money borrowed by the PRT. And this is a very early view. It's from 1907, and you can see an older trolley car, not one of the new modern ones that would be coming along in 7 or 8 years, with the thing subway on it. And you can also see in the center, this is after the service had started on the actual Market Street elevated itself, a Market Street L subway car. This is on the bridge over the Schuylkill River. When the line was originally built, it was elevated at basically Delaware Avenue. Then it was subway from 2nd Street to essentially the east side of the Schuylkill River, where it came above ground. And then it was an elevated all the way from essentially 31st Street to just past the county line, basically where Milbourne Station is, and then it joined the line there. So this is the original line as it was intended to be in 1908. And this is a postcard, thanks to the Library Company of Philadelphia, which shows at about 1908, 1910, when the line was open, the very short Delaware Avenue elevated. It was there because to the background is the ferry terminal, the Pennsylvania Railroad to Camden, and essentially where we're standing was the Reading Railroad's ferry terminal in Camden. So this was built basically to get ferry service, to connect with the ferry service to Camden. All right, so now let's move on to the main topic, what we're all here for. I want to talk a little bit about the planning and the construction of the Frankford L. Okay. First, in the first, essentially from about 1910 to about 1930, but particularly in the period 1910 to about 1920, there were an obsessive number of transit plans for the city of Philadelphia. And there's nothing unique about that. Most major American cities did about the same thing. And most of those plans were never built. So what I want to talk today about is a little about the early proposals. Then I want to talk about how in 1912 the city established a bureau, first called Bureau, then later Department of City Transit, with the idea of they're going to plan and eventually build and operate. Operate was never part of the deal. They were going to contract with someone to operate. And I'm going to talk about the first two people very briefly, because they're incredibly important for Philadelphia transportation history. Okay. A. Merritt Taylor, who was the first director of city transit, is really the person who helped start to do the plans for a rapid transit lines in Philadelphia. If you go on the internet, there are a large number of wonderful maps that people have made using Taylor's transit plans, and these are great plans. But one of the things I always like to point out to people is there was no way these were ever going to be built. And so the idea was, I think Taylor was doing something we might call today spitballing. These are great ideas, let's see kind of what sticks, what's a good idea. He was replaced in 1916 by a man who at that point had had a 35-year career as an engineer for railroads and transit companies. If Merritt Taylor was the great dreamer, who basically came up with great ideas and kind of said, oh, I hope we can somehow pay for these things, Twining was exactly, or Twining, depending on one's pronunciation, was exactly the opposite. He basically said, the only lines that are going to be built are the lines that make money, so let's stop pretending we're going to build a line to Roxborough. We're never going to build a line to Roxborough. Can't afford one. So let's concentrate on what we can actually do. This is what the first Philadelphia, meaning it was issued by the city of Philadelphia, transit plan that I've been able to find. And it's from 1909. And to me, the most fascinating thing about this plan is, what's missing is there is no Frankford L. And in fact, there's a line that would go up Kensington Avenue, but it basically stopped somewhere around Lehigh. And this plan almost sort of is more representative of someone coming up with a plan that conceivably could be built. This is a plan from 1914 of the Frankfurt Elevated, and it actually mirrors almost precisely what was built. So line down Front Street, line down Kensington Avenue, turn onto Frankfurt, and end hanging in the middle of Frankfurt Avenue at Bridge Street. Now the reason why the line ended until, I guess 20 years ago, hanging in the middle of Frankfurt Avenue at Bridge Street, was that was never intended to be the permanent destination. That was, back when this plan was published in 1914, the end of stage one. Stage two would have basically come to where we are today. It would have gone another 3.5 miles down Frankfurt Avenue from Bridge Street and ended here in Holmesburg. And the whole idea behind this plan was everything, virtually everything up to Frankfurt was either built up or was owned by a railroad or an industry and really wasn't capable for new development. So where your development was going to be was north and west of Frankfurt. And so the idea is if you made it all the way to Holmesburg, that would be a great place to end the L, kind of how it, at the western end, it ends at 69th Street. This is a plan from 1923, and this has to do with, in 1923, the city of Philadelphia issued a bond issue to complete its rapid transit plans. Now, if you look at these, Philadelphia didn't complete these plans, and they definitely didn't complete it in a timely manner. Somewhat ironically, the legend says, we've got the funding for all this. Yeah, they didn't have the funding for all that. They had the funding to start all this. But not surprisingly, it shows a Broad Street subway, it shows a Ridge Avenue spur, but actually my personal favorite was, in Center City, there's a Market Street subway, which is what exists. There's a Chestnut Street subway, in which they never started construction, but it was meant to be for trolley cars. And there was a Walnut Street subway. And where they ended up building it was on Locust Street instead. But this was the transit plan that Philadelphia adopted once they had finished the Frankfurt L. And to me, the most substantial thing about this plan is, this was only a year after the L was completed, is there's no longer an extension to Holmesburg. Instead, there's a trolley line called the Northeast Surface Rail Line. And it was sort of a recognition that phase 2 was never going to happen. All right, let's talk about building the L. Construction started in 1950. The L itself was built by the city of Philadelphia, and when complete, was going to be leased to an operator. Now, sadly, there was only one possible operator. It was the only way the L would ever work, since it was designed to make a dead-end connection in with the Market Street line, was the company that at that point had, I believe it was a 25-year lease on the Market Street line, was going to sort of have to operate the combined system. The expected completion date was a completely unrealistic 1918. Now, I always hate to say completely unrealistic, but the fact of the matter is they actually built the West Philadelphia Elevated in 3 years, so there's no reason to think they couldn't build the Frankfurt L, except for 2 small things. The first thing was this thing called World War I. Now, although the United States would not formally enter World War I until the spring of 1917, we basically spent the time from 1914, so a year before we started this, to 1917, selling all the steel we could to the British and the French. So steel prices went through the roof. And so it became very expensive, and what they had to do was slow down. The other problem was the Philadelphia Rapid Transit, the people that operated the Market Street Elevated, really had a great bargaining condition with the city of Philadelphia. The city of Philadelphia wanted its lease payment to equal its cost of building the line, amortized over, I think, 25 or 30 years. I forget what it was. What Philadelphia Rapid Transit said, no, we have to make money doing this. And we've now been running the line in West Philadelphia for a while, so we know it's not as easy to make money as you thought it was. So we need rents that are based on the amount of money we make. So you had the city of Philadelphia saying, you, PRT, have to pay us everything. PRT saying, we'll pay you as much as we can. Don't expect any miracles. And a small problem. The only way to efficiently operate the Frankfurt L was to link it to the line that there was already an agreement with the PRT on. So the PRT had a much better negotiating position. Interestingly enough, the line was it could have easily have been finished in 1921, but it took about another year before it was finished largely because of the inability to come to an agreement with the PRT. Because the city wanted a very long-term contract. The PRT was, how about if we do a short-term contract to begin with? And how about if we don't pay you anything for the first year? So there was sort of negotiations. This, you may notice, is the background slide, the background I've used for all the slides. This is one of my favorite L under construction photographs. And this was taken in 1919. And that nice straight concrete line is the deck of the Frankfurt elevated going down Kensington Avenue. And then it curves. And basically where this is taken is after it curves onto Frankfurt Avenue. Now, what's sort of interesting, and I'll show you the next slide for why it's interesting, but this is built almost, I'm not going to say identical, but very similar in construction to the West Philadelphia elevated, i.e. it's piles on either side going into the sidewalk and essentially a girder going across and supporting the thing. What's sort of innovative is on Frankfurt Avenue, they came up with this idea of what if instead we put a single, much bigger pier in the middle of the street, and then we basically cantilever the L off that. And its advantage is, if you notice, this is actually a photograph taken in Frankfurt in 1919. So it's Frankfurt Avenue and Dyer Street. And this is old-fashioned Frankfurt. Because if you notice, there's some really sort of quaint upper middle class houses that probably date from the 1870s, 1880s on one side. There's not a ton of development yet. So this, if you will, is sort of the end of old Frankfurt. And this is the last of the central piers on the northern end of the L. After this, they had to go to having the piers on the outside to make the station at Bridge Street. This is actually, I came across it, and it's my sort of favorite. I said I love the other L construction photograph. This is actually a really cool detail construction. This was taken in 1922 at Front and Arch Street in Center City, Philadelphia. And they're laying the tracks to connect the new Frankfurt L with the tracks of the old Market Street L. And this is literally seeing them do what is kind of like preparation for the last little bit of work to get this actually operating. All right, so let's talk about 100 years of the L. One of the things that I discovered when I was doing this, and I can honestly say I never thought of it before, is 3 companies have operated the L. It was first the Philadelphia Rapid Transit between 1922 and 1939, then the Philadelphia Transportation Company from 1940. The changeover actually happened at midnight on New Year's that year, to 1968. And since 1968, it's been SEPTA. It never occurred to me that at this point in its history, SEPTA is the longest operating entity to operate the Frankfurt L. It's done so for an excess of 50 years. Okay. So, on November 5th, 1922, L service begins. By 1939, the Delaware Avenue branch is taken out of service. So all trains now run essentially, the short turns here make like complicated, but essentially from Frankfurt to 69th Street. And the Delaware Avenue service ended in 1939, because in 1926 they built what we now call the Benjamin Franklin Bridge, and very quickly the ferry service and demand for taking the ferries fell off. In 1955, there's what I always call the subway extension in West Philadelphia, and instead of coming up where it traditionally did over the Schuylkill River, the subway was extended to just past 40th Street Station and came up, and, as it does today, between 40th Street and 46th Street. Then, if you have traveled on the Frankfurt L in your life, one of the things I always loved was skip-stop service, the A and B trains. Because it was always sort of, you would always tell who was a regular. Because you get some poor person that didn't understand why we weren't stopping at that station. And you then had to tell them, you have to get off, get to the other side. Ideally, you get off and you walk, the 3 blocks, but that doesn't work for everyone. But you have to get to the other side, and you have to beg to get back on, usually. And then you have to make sure you actually get to a skip stop that actually an A or a B that's appropriate for your station. Well, that began in 1956. I had no idea, and I love it. In 1977, as part of the construction of I-95, the Fairmont station and the structure around the Fairmont station was closed and replaced by the Spring Garden station. And if you drive up and down I-95, the Spring Garden station is the sea of concrete basically next to the highway. Between 1988 and 2003, SEPTA reconstructed the Frankfurt L twice. And it started out, did a very thorough reconstruction that was almost done in 1997, and then they kind of discovered something that they had missed. And they had to start all over again. So that's one of the reasons why it took so long. But the great thing about what they had missed is they actually used what they learned when they reconstructed the West Philadelphia subway the next year. But if you now go toward the West on the Market Street subway and Market Street L in far West Philadelphia, you'll see they finally do have center posts. And that had to be done so that they could, in fact, widen Market Street. Right? And then, to me, which is sort of the last significant improvement, in 2003, just 81 years after it was a reality, people finally admitted we aren't really going to extend the L north of Bridge Street anymore. Which, strangely enough, by 2011, they were talking about doing that. But so they finally moved what we now call the Frankfurt Transportation Center to the side of the street for better operating efficiency. So this is the equipment that's sort of used. There's essentially 4 generations, or if you're me, 4.5 generations of equipment that were used on the L. And the kind of fun thing about this equipment is, with the exception of the things that SEPTA called M1s, I will apologize to all people that are PTC fans. I know PTC had a different numbering system, and I know it's kind of weird that SEPTA is so anal retentive that even though none of the M1s survived anywhere near the existence of SEPTA, SEPTA still numbered them M1. I've been always proud of that. So M1 were the cars built for the Market Street elevated subway through Center City in West Philadelphia. And this shows 2 of them at the 40th Street station. Although the Coast Guard doesn't say so, my assumption has always been this has to be very early on at the start of service, because if you look at the train to the left, there's a ton of well-dressed people standing in the front windows to see what's going on. And while, as a child, I will point out, and you'll see a photograph that I took from there, I've often stood by the front windows of the L. It is a cool thing to do. I honestly don't believe dozens of well-dressed men did that in 1910, unless there was a reason. The M1s were built in 3 batches by Press Steel Car of Pittsburgh. Cleverly enough, the PRT ordered them in sort of sections so that they didn't have one big bill at one time. And that's one of the reasons why if you ever see early photographs of the L, they're always 3-car trains. There simply weren't that many cars. This is the interior of an M1. It's, it's actually a very nice interior. The M2s, which are the cars that the city of Philadelphia built for the Frankfurt L, were technically more advanced cars, but their interiors were really terrible. And they were essentially nothing but longitudinal seats that ran along the line. They were to maximize the standee room on the trains. And that car is probably from 1922 when it was put into service, and you can barely read it, but it says City of Philadelphia, Frankford Avenue elevated. These are the photographs that I took, and the one on the left proves that I did stand by the front windows of the L from time to time. And these are the M3s. These were built by the Bud Company in its Red Lion plant, not all that far from here. And these were state-of-the-art stainless steel subway cars that went into service in 1960. And when I say state-of-the-art, they were only lacking one thing. And if you, like I, rode the elevated sections of the L in the summertime, it's amazing how hot that the cars could get. And the only cooling they had were the funny little bumps on the roof, which were fans. And as a matter of fact, I understand some fans, i.e. buffs, call them Almond Joy cars because they kind of look like the bumps of Almond Joy. These cars were designed to have air conditioning installed in them, but Philadelphia didn't have the money to do it. These cars were eventually built, I think 3 years later, for the Tokyo subway system, where the Japanese did in fact pay the money to have them air conditioned. But Philadelphia finally air conditioned one of the cars as a test. And it cost so much money, they didn't air condition anything else. And so the photograph on the right is I am bored, I am sitting at the Norristown high-speed line platform, and there's an L squealing its way around the thing, and I just took a photograph. I had never noticed until someone pointed this out to me. I took that photograph in 1981. It was not till 2015, and someone pointed out to me, that's the only air-conditioned L car. If I remember correctly, its number was 614, but I'm willing to be corrected on that. And I was always sort of fascinated by it, because if you rode the L in the summertime, what you did is you hung out under the fans and hoped for the best. And you didn't get cool, but you had hot air blown across you. These are the current cars. Construction began in 1999. These are known as the M4s. They're built by Trans, and they've had at least 2 service scares, but they've been put back into service on a fairly regular basis. And I always love this photograph. This is from SEPTA, and I often pick on SEPTA because I often think they use the worst possible photographs to illustrate things. I mean, I've literally seen photographs on the front of commuter railroad timetables that would convince you you never wanted to ride that train because it looked so run down and depressed. But that's a great photograph. All right, so what I'm just going to end my formal presentation on is what was the effect of the Frankfurt L on Northeast Philadelphia. Interestingly enough, it was the exact effect that A. Merritt Taylor wanted. It opened up a large portion of the Northeast to development. This is a photograph from 1915, and that billboard says, "Now is the time to buy before the coming of the elevated railway advances value." I like the fact that realtors, it's value, not prices. And what you see is essentially a new Frankfurt being built. Not the photographs that we saw before of this cute little, almost rural village, but an urban neighborhood that would remind you in many ways of the urban neighborhoods that were built west of 40th Street in West Philadelphia. There were also deliberately planned extensions to the Frankfurt L that were part of the Frankfurt L. This is one of them. This is a map of the Bustleton surface line, which was a trolley car that went up to Bustleton. And the city of Philadelphia built the line. The city of Philadelphia paid for the cars used on the line, the terrible little dinky cars, and the PRT operated them. But this was a formal part of the L. The whole idea was this would open up area for development. And this is the Frankfurt trolley terminal in 1930. And essentially, Frankfurt, which had always been this weird little transportation hub from the coming of the trolley and before, thanks to the L, kind of takes on the role that 69th Street Terminal did for development for Delaware County. And a ton of trolley routes now operate out of there, and they sort of open up everything. And what I'm going to end on is actually one of my favorite things. I'm often asked, because I give presentations like this, transportation history questions. And almost every transportation history question is very specific. I have literally been asked, what was the OWL service on the Route 38 Bering Street trolley in 1938? And I normally have to say, you may want to look, there are trolley guides. But the most common question I get asked, hey, what about that subway station on the Roosevelt Boulevard under either the Sears Tower, which it wasn't, under the Sears store, which it wasn't, or under the Sears parking garage, which it was? And the story to me has always been one of the fascinating things, because it's also known affectionately as the Adams Avenue station, because if you know where that curve is on the Roosevelt Boulevard, poor little Adams Avenue gets really ripped into various pieces that don't make a whole ton of sense. But this is on the western side of the Roosevelt Boulevard, and the parking garage was built in the mid-1960s, 1965, right behind the Sears store. Now, I remember going to the Sears store as a child. I don't remember being in this parking garage, but but one of the fascinating things is, if you go on the internet today, you will find dozens of photographs of the subway station that was never opened. This is a great story. It has nothing to do with the Frankford L. It has everything to do with the Broad Street subway. But the idea was, in the late 1950s and 1960s, as they were planning what we now know as the Roosevelt Expressway, hey, we can link that up to the Broad Street subway and bring bring a subway train to Northeast Philadelphia. Sears Roebuck, with the permission of the city of Philadelphia. And I always find this funny, because I've often wondered, who the heck did you get permission from? Do you walk in to the thing of city transit? I'm thinking of building a subway station. But Philadelphia had no objection to this. And as a matter of fact, this is in the Philadelphia City Archives, this photograph. They completed, but never made a parking space, the basement of their parking garage in 1965. And the idea was, you could, if you actually spent the money, you could easily put a subway station in here. And so what that would guarantee for Sears is the only subway station was going to be darn close to their store. And in an odd sense, it might, although knowing the city of Philadelphia, it probably might not, save you a little bit of money because someone roughed out a subway station for you. But I was always fascinated by this, and I'm always incredibly depressed. If you go on the internet, you will see dozens of photographs of the Locust Street subway before it opened. Dozens of photographs from the Arch Street subway, which has never opened. And they're always identified as this one. And the way you know it's not this one is they're all using 1930s technology. And this was built in 1965. So if it existed, and I'm going to say it did, if you believe it existed, this is as much of a subway station you got. I actually knew friends of mine. I went to Temple in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and I knew friends of mine who were convinced there was actually a subway station down there. And so if you went down there, if you somehow broke into the Sears store, which I understand from multiple people, I never did this, that this wasn't terribly difficult to get into. But their thought was, if you went in there, you were going to see a completely pristine, unused subway station. No, you're going to see a space that could be a used subway station. So I'm going to end my talk, and if anyone has any questions, I will sort of gladly answer them. But I've always loved this, as I say. Of all the questions I've ever been asked, I've probably been asked this about 30 times. And probably the next common question is, why did the Paoli local end in Paoli? And I kind of look at them and go, well, why not? But, thank you.